Welcome, friends, to another edition of Economic Update, weekly program devoted to the economic dimensions of our lives. Jobs, debts, incomes, going up, going down, for us, for our kids. I'm your host, Richard Wolff. I've been a professor of economics all my adult life, and I hope that it has prepared me well to present these weekly updates to you. So let's jump right in. Filling the airways, confronting us at every turn, is news these days of a so-called tax reform. President Trump, the House, and the Senate are all busily writing tax laws. And the way that works in the United States, the president talks a lot about it, but he doesn't do much. The work of defining what we pay in taxes is done by the House of Representatives and the Senate, and they do it separately. So two groups of politicians writing laws about how taxes will change. And of course, every single one of those politicians is besieged year-round, but especially now, by highly paid lobbyists, begging, pleading, threatening them to do what their payers want them to do. And of course, who can afford to send a lobbyist to Washington to play games there all day, every day, year-round? It's the biggest, richest corporations and associations of corporations and specialty interests of all kind that can afford the lobbyist. You can't. And the results are very predictable. I won't bore you by going over what the media already teaches us, that the winners from this tax reform are the usual winners. The biggest corporations, number one, and the richest people, number two. And everybody else stands further down the line to get what little crumbs may be left. What you may not know, besides all of this, is that the law is very complicated. It has many, many details. Details that can make a difference of millions of dollars for a company, for an industry, for a region. That's why the lobbyists are there, to take care of the interests who pay them to be there. And here are a couple you may not have heard about. One plan, which seems to be agreed by both the House and Senate, although they differ on the details, is to eliminate the estate tax. There's only 2,000 or 3,000 people in America rich enough to pay the estate tax these days, because it exempts everybody who leaves less than $10, $11, or $12 million to their heirs, which means you and me. So these 2,000 or 3,000 families that are super rich, who are leaving so much that they actually have to pay some tax, don't want to pay it. And being as rich as they are, they can afford the lobbyists. And so I have to report to you that the estate tax is sure to be reduced or eliminated altogether. Wonderful news for 2,000 or 3,000 of the richest families in America. Bad news, of course, for the rest of us, because if they don't pay their taxes, the government has three choices. It can either cut spending on government programs, because it doesn't have the money from these rich people who don't pay estate taxes anymore, or it can raise our taxes to make up for the government what they're not getting from these rich families, or they can borrow the money that they're no longer raising from these rich families. And here's the wonderful joke there. When the government borrows because it hasn't taxed rich people, it's typically the rich people who lend to the government the money they don't have to pay in taxes anymore. This either makes you smile by the sheer horror of it, or cry because we are the victims any way this plays out. Here's a couple more you may not have heard about. The version of tax reform passed by the House of Representatives has a wonderful gift. This time of year, gifts are big. For graduate students going to school in America. In many American graduate programs at universities, it is the custom to give graduate students who need financial help, which is most of them, the following benefit. It's called a tuition waiver. You don't have to pay the tuition that is high at these schools, and they give you a stipend. It's usually in the neighborhood of $6,000 to $12,000 per year. That's level poverty, below poverty level for a graduate student. So the graduate student has two benefits: a low amount of money and a waiver on the tuition. The House of Representatives, which has proposed massive cuts in taxes for corporations and the rich, has proposed taking away from graduate students the tuition waiver so that they will get it, but they'll have to declare it on their income tax because it's like an income, and so they will be required to pay a tax on it, making the cost of a graduate education more expensive to a graduate student than it was before. Around the world, particularly in Europe, college costs are being brought down. Here in the United States, we're going the other way. Basically, the tax rewrite is a scandal. And let me close on this by quoting to you Professor Jeffrey Sachs of Columbia University, who referred to the tax bills working their way through Congress as, quote, a war of the rich against the poor, end quote. Much of today's material, let's call it, is about the big corporate leaders to whom we entrust such enormous power. In future programs, I'll be talking about the merger wave that is bringing huge companies to get together with one another and become even huger. But even before we get to that, I want to talk about what it means to give such extraordinary wealth and power to such a relatively tiny proportion of the American people, who therefore have economic power, which they use to get political power, etc. But it helps, I think, to be specific. So let's start. Majorities of workers who are polled say they would like more say on the job. They would like to have more input on what goes on at the workplace where they spend most of their adult lives. You know that on this program we often advocate for real democracy at the workplace, to give workers what they want by making it a democratic arrangement, the workplace. One person, one vote, no matter what you do, you have a stake in what goes on, you have to live with the consequences, and democracy says you ought to have a right to participate. But of course, that's not the way capitalist corporations work. So let's see some examples of what that means. I want to start with Joe Ricketts, Ricketts. If you haven't heard of him, let me introduce you. He is the founder of TD Ameritrade, one of the largest discount stock brokerages in the United States. His family owns the Chicago Cubs baseball team. You know, just like your neighbor. He's worth more than $2 billion. A few years ago, he started a very interesting local news site in New York City called DNA Info. He did something similar in Chicago. It was really interesting way to bring local news to an urban area. He's also a major right-wing donor to political activities. During the presidential primary, he spent millions of dollars denouncing Donald Trump as an untrustworthy, dangerous misogynist. Once Mr. Trump was secured in his nomination, Mr. Ricketts spent $1 million to support him. I mention these details because they are not unusual. 6 months ago, the reporters who work at DNA Info in New York City, and at the Gothamist, a website that he also owns and operates in New York City, announced their intention, the reporters and editors did, to join the Writers Guild of America, a trade union. This is something that has been done by the reporters at Huffington Post, Vice Media, Slate, and Thrillist, major well-known websites. In response, Joe Ricketts, the owner of these things, shut them down. He fired the entire crew, closed the service, the public doesn't have access to these websites anymore, and these people all lost their jobs. I don't have much more to say. One person made a decision, And that's the result for the public and for the employees. Case closed. Think about it. Here's another story about what large corporate executives, to whom we entrust enormous power, what they can do and do with that power. I want to talk to you briefly about Jeffrey Immelt, I-M-M-E-L-T. You may not know him, but you should, because he was until recently, and for many years, the president of the General Electric Corporation, one of the most important and largest corporations in the United States. He isn't anymore, and what often happens when an executive retires with hundreds of millions of dollars in pay and an incredible retirement package and all the rest, but after he's gone, things can be revealed about him that somehow managed not to get so well revealed while he was in power. And Mr. Immelt really got revealed with a doozy. It turns out that much of his activity involved flying all over the world because General Electric is a multinational corporation and has activities across the 5 continents. Well, that isn't unusual, but here's what was. When Mr. Immelt flew, a second equivalent jet, empty, flew behind him, just in case something might have gone wrong at some point in the flight, and Mr. Immelt would have needed another plane. The cost of maintaining a second plane that was most of the time empty is staggering, runs into the millions of dollars. But that's what Mr. Immelt wanted. Oh, he said he didn't know anything about it. This was in the hands of the flight director for GE. The man who has replaced Mr. Immelt, deeply embarrassed by the stunning self-indulgent luxury. Imagine Mr. Immelt's plane might have had a problem. He would have had to get on a first-class flight to finish his trip. He didn't want that. He wanted his own airplane, probably with his own teddy bear, so he could complete the flight. He used the money of General Electric to pay for it. And so I want you all to understand that when you bought that electric toaster for your grandma or the electric clock to wake up in the morning, part of the price you paid was to enable Jeffrey Immelt to have an empty plane trailing him all over the world. You put your faith in the people who run these corporations as individuals, that's what you get. Nothing has been in the news more, besides the tax bill, than the issue of sexual harassment by people in power over those who depend on them, those who want to get a job, those who want their career to move up, those who want to keep a job, etc. And we have seen unbelievable examples across the spectrum, left, right, business, politics, it really doesn't seem to matter. You put a few people in positions of power that other people depend on, and you've created the incentive and the situation which can turn out as we have seen. And I want to give you one particular example because it illustrates it. This has to do with the highest secretary minister in the government of Theresa May in the United Kingdom, a man by the name of Damien Green. He's gotten himself into trouble. First, he was accused by a subordinate of sexual harassment and intimidation. Number two, one of the highest police officials in London reported that when they raided his office, they found large amounts of pornography on his computer, etc., etc. This is a big embarrassment for the government of Theresa May. It comes a short time after Britain's defense minister, Michael Fallon, resigned from his job as Minister of Defense. I should parenthetically explain to my American audience that in other countries, when you get caught doing this sort of thing, you're out. we here in America don't move so quickly, at least much of the time. Now, Mr. Green has defended himself. He didn't do anything. He said it was not true that he had done what the wife and the others of the people involved have suggested. And what was that? Apparently, he was in a bar with a young woman who worked for him. And they discussed, this is the testimony given, her career aspirations and gossiped about sexual affairs in Parliament. Then he was alleged to have done the deed. I don't want to reiterate the details. You all know many more details than you probably want to already. I want to drive home a particular point. While there are many things that cause particularly men to be sexual predators, particularly towards women, there is something that has to be said here about the economics of it. And those have to do with a situation of hierarchy. If you make a few people in a position to give or not give you a job, to let you move up or down in the career path, to let you keep the job, you are creating a structure that fosters this problem. And you're not going to solve the problem unless you deal with that structure. Here's another argument for worker co-op as a better way to organize an enterprise. Everybody participates in hiring everybody. The workers collectively are their own boss. Everybody is on both sides of that game, and therefore you will not see these kinds of shenanigans, at least nowhere near as often or as regularly. That has to be addressed. Otherwise, we end up telling people, just don't do that. Men, you shouldn't do that. That's likely to be about as successful as telling people, don't do drugs. We've been doing that for decades, and we all know how successful that's been. Some short ones, but before I get to them, let me remind you, we maintain 2 websites where we add material, where we provide you with all kinds of additional services, and we would like you to partner with us in making use of these items. The first website is rdwolff with 2 Fs.com, and the second one is democracyatwork.info. These are websites through which you can communicate to us what you like and would like us to do or don't like about the program. They allow you to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. For those of you that are listeners to this program on the radio but might like to see it in television form, please go to patreon.com, that's Patreon, patreon.com/economic update, where you can do precisely that. Make use of these websites, all the facilities they have, partner with us. It's a way of extending the effect and the usefulness that this program seeks to have. I want to go back to Detroit, a city I go back to a lot because it's like an emblem of what's going on in America. Recently, some big businesses have bought parts of downtown Detroit and rebuilt it up a bit with hotels and expensive restaurants and a convention center. And that's fine, that's better than doing nothing, I get that. But out of it has come a language about the renaissance of Detroit and how the system has built back Detroit. This is simply not true. And I wanted to find, and I have found, a statistic that can summarize it. Before 2007 and the crash, the annual number of mortgages written for people in Detroit was between 6,000 and 8,500, the number of mortgages for homes bought in Detroit. Since 2009, that is, once the crash hit, the average number is a few hundred or less. Bank America and J.P. Morgan Chase have made claims to be helping Detroit turn around. In 2016, with Detroit's population of 637,000, the Bank of America did exactly 18 mortgages, and J.P. Morgan did 6. The 2 bigger banks in the mortgage business did a total of 24 mortgages, when before the annual was in the neighborhood of 6,000 to 8,500. There is no rebuilding of Detroit except for the money-making downtown that will mostly service tourists and other conventions and leave the vast majority of Detroit in the condition that we know it to have. Next item. There's been a lot of attention paid to the really disaster across America's malls. Huge retail giants, Macy's, Sears, Nordstrom, all announced huge numbers of store closings in 2017. Many of them did it in 2016 too. It is, in short, a disaster because these malls employed many people, because these malls paid taxes to the local community they will no longer pay, and because it isn't beautiful for a town to have an empty mall with weeds growing up through the cracks in the asphalt. And so the question has been raised, what's happening? And the answer, because people don't want to face what's going on in America, the answer has been given, well, everybody's going to the internet. They're not going to the mall, they're staying home and buying, etc. Of course, that's part of the story, but there's economics behind this. One of the reasons they're going to the internet is they can get the things cheaper that way than going to the mall. And the proof that cheapness is the issue is when you discover that while Macy's and Nordstrom's and Sears are in trouble, TJ Maxx, the stores that are in malls but are very much cheaper, are doing much better than those more expensive stores. The bottom line being, Americans can't afford anymore, and they're going where their cheapness is because their incomes are lagging. They've had no raises for 10 or 20 years, and it's showing up as it worsens the economic scenario. Next item. Tenants in America. We keep track in America of tenants. How much of their income are they required to pay for their rental every month? It's an index of how well people are doing or not. Here's a statistic for you to think about. In 1960, tenants who spent more than a third of their income on rent numbered about 25%. Roughly a quarter of renters had to pay more than a third of their income just for rent. In 2015, it had doubled. Half of the people in America who rent had to pay more than a third of their income in rent. That's a sign of being fundamentally pinched in your economic situation in terms of the life you can live and the level of life you can afford. And here's something that staggered me even more. Last year, 2016, black renters, which is the overwhelming majority of black families in America, 12% of them were threatened at one time or another with eviction because they couldn't make the rent. 1 in 8 black families went through the experience, the terror, the anxiety, the fear that the mother, the father, the kids, the children would be thrown out on the street, evicted, because they couldn't make enough money to make the rent. Economic recovery? No, these are not statistics about recovery. These are statistics about a disaster that keeps unfolding. The final economic update that we will have time for has to do with another one of these corporations to whom we have entrusted not just our general welfare, but literally our lives and health. I'm talking about Astra-Zeneca, one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the world. I'm going to read to you just a few of the achievements of this very profitable, huge multinational pharmaceutical. In April 2010, AstraZeneca settled a lawsuit brought by an American for $520 million. Oh, they must have done bad things. Here's what they did. They defrauded, ready, Medicare, Medicaid, and other government-funded healthcare programs in connection with marketing and promotion of their blockbuster antipsychotic drug, Seroquel. In March 2011, that's basically a year later. It settled another lawsuit in the United States totaling $69 million, divided up among 38 states. Astra-Zeneca is the producer of a drug you may know called Nexium. Nexium. It's for gastric distress, in your guts, etc. In 2007, Dr. Marcia Angel, formerly editor-in-chief of the New England Journal of Medicine and a lecturer in social medicine at the Harvard Medical School, denounced AstraZeneca for fraudulent reporting on the effects of Nexium to get it sold in the United States. They make billions off that drug. To give you an idea that this is a really fine group of folks here at the top, in February of 1998, Astra USA, a subsidiary, sued Lars Bildman, its former president and chief executive officer, seeking $15 million from Mr. Bildman for defrauding the company. The sum included money he allegedly used to fix up 3 of his homes, plus money the company paid as a result of an EEOC investigation. Astra's lawsuit alleges against their own president that he sexually harassed and intimidated employees, used company funds for yachts and for prostitutes, and so on and so on. The mixture of profit-making corporations and health, as we have shown on this program over and over again, is literally a lethal combination. Profit-making leads people to make decisions that are not good for much of the world we live in, whether it's climate crises, whether it's health crises, wherever. It's time to face that the solution to many of our problems goes beyond this or that rule and regulation. System change is on the agenda, and we should get on with an honest debate about whether we can do better than capitalism and how to go about it. We've come to the end of the first half of today's program. Thank you very much for staying with us. Please continue. We will be right back.